Marvin Jefferson stepped into the restaurant, taking a slow breath as he adjusted the collar of his suit jacket. He had always liked to dress sharp, even if it was just for himself. At 78, he was spry for his age, his posture as straight as ever. Tonight he was excited to try this restaurant, one that his granddaughter Maya had been raving about for weeks. She'd even made a reservation for him, her way of making sure he'd feel special. He smiled softly, his anticipation warm in his chest. The evening felt like a promise, one that would give him a small taste of the life he'd always wanted, filled with refined spaces and exceptional food. As he approached the hostess stand, Marvin noticed the young woman barely glanced up from her tablet. She tapped her fingernails against the screen, checking something before her eyes briefly flitted to him. There was a subtle shift in her expression, a flicker of dismissal that Marvin had learned to recognize over the years. But he ignored it, as he always had, and offered her a polite smile. "Good evening, Mom. I have a reservation," he said, his voice gentle. She raised an eyebrow, barely acknowledging him. "Name?" she asked curtly, as if she were already preparing to correct him. "It's under Maya Jefferson," he replied, still smiling. "My granddaughter arranged it." The hostess's lips tightened. She glanced at her tablet screen, her eyes scanning the reservations list with a faint look of impatience. After what felt like an unnecessarily long moment, she nodded without looking at him. "Follow me," she said, her tone clipped and impersonal. Marvin trailed behind her, holding back his disappointment. He knew that look, that tone, the kind that made a person feel like an intruder rather than a guest. But he shook it off, reminding himself that he was here to enjoy the evening. It was a minor irritation, he told himself, nothing that would ruin the night. He'd dealt with much worse in his day. The hostess led him to a small table tucked away in the dimmest corner of the restaurant, right next to the kitchen doors. Marvin hesitated for a second, glancing around the restaurant. There were plenty of other open tables and better spots, ones by the windows, where he could have enjoyed a view of the city lights, or at least somewhere away from the clattering sounds of the kitchen. But the hostess had already placed the menu on the table and was turning to leave before he could say anything. "Excuse me," Marvin called after her, his voice polite but firm. She paused, barely turning her head, her expression a mixture of irritation and boredom. Would it be possible to sit somewhere else? Perhaps one of those open tables by the windows? The hostess sighed, not even trying to hide her impatience. "This is the only table available for single diners at the moment," she replied, her tone bordering on dismissive. "If you wanted a specific seat, you should have mentioned it when you booked." Marvin felt a pang of irritation but held his tongue. He didn't want to make a scene, especially not over something that could be seen as trivial. So he nodded and sat down, watching as she walked away without so much as a backward glance. He glanced around, noticing the staff moving gracefully around the other tables, attending to the patrons with warm smiles and attentive gestures. Every time he tried to catch a waiter's eye, however, they seemed to look right past him. The minutes ticked by, and no one approached his table to take his order. Marvin folded his hands in his lap, keeping his composure as best he could. He'd been looking forward to this evening, and he wasn't about to let a little neglect ruin it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a waiter approached. The man barely looked at Marvin, his attention seemingly elsewhere. "What can I get for you?" he asked, sounding as though he were asking out of obligation rather than genuine interest. Marvin offered the waiter a small smile, trying to bridge the gap. "I'd like to start with a glass of your house red, please. And could I see a menu?" The waiter sighed, pulling out a menu from beneath his arm and handing it to Marvin without making eye contact. "House red, sure? I'll get that for you," he mumbled, already turning to leave. Marvin's hand tightened around the menu as he watched the waiter walk away, disappearing back into the bustle of the restaurant. He tried to ignore the sting of embarrassment, the subtle shame that came with feeling invisible. This wasn't the first time he'd been treated this way in a place like this, but he'd thought things were different now. After all, it was 2024, and Maya had promised him that this place was different, progressive even. As he waited, Marvin could hear faint whispers from a nearby table where a couple of the younger servers had gathered, chatting while they thought no one was paying attention. "Who let that guy in?" one of them muttered, his voice laced with disdain. "He looks so out of place here." The other server stifled a laugh, casting a sideways glance in Marvin's direction. Must have slipped through the cracks. Can you imagine the look on the manager's face if he saw? Marvin swallowed hard, his heart sinking. He focused on the menu in front of him, trying to drown out their words. The hurt gnawed at him, but he kept his face impassive, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing his disappointment. He'd come here to enjoy himself, and that's what he would do, no matter how they tried to make him feel. When the waiter finally returned with his wine, he set it down without a word, then walked off before Marvin could ask any questions about the menu or get a recommendation. Taking a sip of the wine, Marvin realized that it wasn't what he'd wanted at all, bitter and sharp, completely opposite to his taste. Just as Marvin was beginning to wonder if he should cut his losses and leave, the restaurant doors opened, and he caught sight of a familiar face, Maya, his granddaughter. She walked in with her usual confidence, her professional demeanor unmistakable. Marvin's spirits lifted slightly, though he was reluctant to share what had happened. He didn't want to spoil her evening or make a fuss. Maya approached the hostess stand, her keen eyes already scanning the room. When she spotted Marvin tucked away in the corner by the kitchen, her brows knitted in confusion. She strode over, her heels clicking with purpose, and sat down across from him, reaching out to take his hand. "Grandpa," she said, her voice soft yet curious. "I thought they'd seat you somewhere nicer. Why are you back here?" Marvin hesitated, not wanting to make a big deal of it. "Oh, it's nothing, honey," he replied, giving her a reassuring smile. "I just thought I'd sit wherever they put me." Maya's eyes narrowed as she looked around, noticing the way the other patrons were attended to with care and respect, a stark contrast to how her grandfather had been treated. She could feel a flicker of anger rising within her, but she kept her tone calm. "Did they at least treat you well?" she asked, studying his expression closely. He gave a non-committal shrug, his smile faint. "Well enough, I suppose," he replied, trying to brush it off. But Maya could see the disappointment in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped slightly, as if he were shrinking under the weight of the disrespect he'd endured. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. Marvin had raised her with a strong sense of dignity and self-respect, teaching her to always stand up for herself and others. Seeing him treated this way made her blood boil, and she knew she couldn't just sit by and let it slide. "Excuse me for a moment, Grandpa," she said, squeezing his hand. She rose from her seat and approached the hostess stand, where the young woman who'd seated Marvin was chatting with another employee, both laughing softly about something on their phones. Maya cleared her throat, and they looked up, startled. "Hi," Maya began, her voice calm but laced with authority. "I'm Maya Jefferson, one of the primary investors here." She watched as their eyes widened in shock, their laughter dying on their lips. Maya's words hit the hostess and the waiter with the force of a sudden icy wind. They stared at her, the realization dawning on their faces as their careless attitudes crumbled into alarm. Maya's gaze was steady, unwavering, and her expression conveyed all the authority she wielded, a presence that immediately silenced any attempt at excuses. "Would you mind explaining," she continued, her voice sharp but calm, "why my grandfather was seated in the corner by the kitchen when there were plenty of better tables available?" The hostess blinked, clearly at a loss for words. She fumbled with her tablet, as if searching for some invisible list of excuses. We weren't aware he was your grandfather," she stammered, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "And does that make a difference?" Maya shot back, crossing her arms. "Shouldn't every guest be treated with respect here?" The hostess swallowed, glancing nervously at the waiter beside her, who looked equally panicked. "Of course, ma'am. It must have been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya took a step closer, her voice lowering. "Misunderstanding or not, I expect every person who walks in here to be treated with the dignity they deserve," she said. Her eyes moved to the waiter. "And I heard your comments. You may not have known he was my grandfather, but you certainly assumed he wasn't worth your time or respect." The waiter's face turned a shade paler, and he stammered, I'm very sorry. It won't happen again." Maya didn't soften. She kept her gaze steady on the two employees, the frustration simmering beneath her calm demeanor. She'd seen this kind of disrespect before too often, in fact. Her grandfather had worked hard all his life, raising his family with pride and resilience, and she would not stand for him to be treated as if he were invisible, as if he didn't belong. "Good," she said firmly, "because there will be consequences if I hear about this kind of treatment again. Not just for him, but for any guest." She took a steadying breath and allowed the weight of her words to settle over them. "Consider this your only warning." Both the hostess and the waiter nodded, their expressions chastened. Maya gave them one last look, ensuring the message had sunk in before she turned back to her grandfather's table. As she walked, she could feel the eyes of other patrons on her, some of them wide with curiosity, others with silent approval. She ignored them, focusing only on the relief of returning to her grandfather. Marvin looked up as she approached, a faint smile on his face. He hadn't heard the full exchange, but he could tell from Maya's expression that she had taken matters into her own hands. "Everything all right, honey?" he asked, his voice gentle. She took her seat again, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Yes, Grandpa," she replied, her tone softening for him. "Everything's taken care of. You won't have to worry about anyone giving you trouble here again." He chuckled lightly, a hint of pride mingling with his amusement. "Well, I suppose it's good to have someone powerful in the family, isn't it?" Maya smiled, though she could still feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Powerful or not, they should have treated you with respect from the start," she said. "That's non-negotiable." As they sat together, the change in the restaurant's atmosphere was palpable. Waiters moved past their table with newfound attentiveness, glancing over to make sure they didn't need anything, their previous indifference now replaced with a careful, almost anxious respect. Even the manager, alerted by the hostess, made a quiet appearance, offering Marvin a sincere apology and ensuring both he and Maya that their experience would be handled with the utmost care. But Maya wasn't fully satisfied. She knew apologies were easy enough to offer, it was change that mattered. And right now, she didn't trust the management to follow through on their promises. She made a mental note to address this further, but for now she was content to focus on her grandfather and make sure he enjoyed his evening. "Grandpa," she said, leaning in with a smile, "what do you say we order dessert? I think you deserve something extra sweet tonight." Marvin's face lit up, the earlier hurt gradually fading as he looked over the dessert menu. "Well, I won't say no to that. You know I've got a bit of a sweet tooth," he replied with a chuckle. They ordered a decadent chocolate souffle, something that Maya knew he loved, and the two of them spent the next hour laughing and talking, the earlier tension melting away in the warmth of their conversation. For Marvin, the moment felt almost magical, like a bridge between the dignity of his past and the strength of his granddaughter's future. He had always been proud of her, but tonight he felt a deeper, quieter pride, one that came from knowing that she would carry forward the values he held so dear. Just as they were finishing up, Maya excused herself to the restroom, leaving Marvin alone at the table. He leaned back, letting out a contented sigh. He could see the staff casting furtive glances in his direction, their nervous expressions almost making him chuckle. It was strange, he thought, how one simple act of respect or lack thereof could ripple through a place like this. But he didn't hold any grudges. He was just glad to have had this evening with his granddaughter. As Maya made her way back to the table, she noticed that the hostess and the waiter were standing nearby, both of them looking hesitant but clearly wanting to approach. She paused, raising an eyebrow as they took a cautious step forward. "Miss Jefferson," the hostess began, her voice hesitant but sincere, "I just wanted to say I'm really sorry for how we treated your grandfather. I didn't mean any harm, but I realize now that it was wrong." Maya gave her a measured look, letting the silence stretch for a moment. She wanted to believe the apology was genuine, but she also knew how easily words could be spoken without any true change behind them. "Thank you," she replied, her tone neutral. "But understand that it's not just about him. I expect every guest who walks through those doors to be treated with respect." The hostess nodded, glancing down as if absorbing the weight of her words. "I understand. It won't happen again." Maya took a deep breath, letting her own tension dissipate slightly. "Good," she said, "because respect shouldn't depend on who someone is or who they know. It's something every person deserves." With that, she returned to her seat beside Marvin, who had been watching the exchange with quiet interest. He gave her a knowing smile as she sat down. "You know, Maya, you've got quite a way with words," he said, his voice full of admiration. She laughed softly, feeling the weight of the evening begin to ease. "I guess I learned from the best," she replied, reaching out to hold his hand again. As they finished their meal, Maya knew that this was only the beginning of the changes she wanted to implement. She wasn't going to let this slip by unnoticed. Her mind was already working on a plan to ensure the staff received proper sensitivity training, and she was determined to make this restaurant a place where anyone could walk in and feel valued. But for tonight, her focus was on Marvin, on making sure he felt seen and celebrated, if only for this one evening. They rose to leave, and as they walked through the restaurant, the staff watched them with a newfound respect. The manager held the door open for them, offering another polite apology as they stepped outside into the cool night air. As they walked toward the street, Marvin looked over at his granddaughter, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding pride. "Thank you, Maya," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "For everything." She smiled, feeling the strength of his gratitude settle within her. "You've done the same for me, Grandpa. It's the least I could do." The next morning, Maya sat at her desk, already drafting an email to the restaurant's manager and other stakeholders. She'd had time to think about the events of the previous night, and the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. Apologies were easy to give, but real change would require concrete steps, and Maya wasn't the type to settle for half measures. Her grandfather's quiet resilience had reminded her why she'd become an investor in the restaurant industry in the first place. It wasn't just about profits, it was about creating spaces where people felt valued and welcomed, no matter who they were. As she finished typing the email, her phone buzzed. It was a call from the restaurant's general manager, who had likely heard about last night from the staff. Maya took a deep breath, preparing herself to address everything calmly but firmly. "Hello, Mr. Davis," she answered, her tone polite yet direct. "Good morning, Ms. Jefferson," he began, his voice laced with tension. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened last night. I understand that your grandfather was not treated with the respect he deserved, and I take full responsibility for that. I can assure you that we'll address this with the staff." Maya appreciated the promptness of his response, but she sensed he was hoping a quick apology would smooth things over. She wasn't going to let it be that simple. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," she replied. "However, I think it's important to go beyond just addressing the issue with the staff. I'd like to meet in person to discuss a more comprehensive plan to ensure this doesn't happen again to my family or to any other guest." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if he hadn't expected her to press for more. "Of course," he replied after a moment. "I'm open to any suggestions you have. When would you like to meet?" "Today, if possible," Maya said. "I'd like to take care of this sooner rather than later." They agreed to meet at noon, and as she ended the call, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't going to settle for a superficial fix. This was an opportunity to create lasting change, not just at this restaurant, but hopefully as a model for others. By noon, Maya was seated in the restaurant's private dining room, waiting for Mr. Davis to arrive. As she sat there, she glanced around, noticing the subtle elegance of the room, the soft lighting, the carefully chosen decor. It was designed to be welcoming, yet her grandfather had been treated as if he didn't belong in a place like this. The irony wasn't lost on her, and it only strengthened her resolve. Mr. Davis entered the room a few minutes later, carrying a folder and looking slightly nervous. Maya gave him a polite nod, inviting him to sit down. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice," he said, offering a tight smile. "I appreciate your promptness," Maya replied, diving straight into business. "As I mentioned on the phone, last night's incident was disappointing, to say the least. My grandfather came here expecting a pleasant evening, and instead, he was met with hostility and disrespect. I know this wasn't the first time he's experienced this, but I'm determined to make sure it's the last, at least in an establishment where I have any influence." Mr. Davis nodded, flipping open his folder to reveal a document detailing the restaurant's current policies. "I understand completely, Ms. Jefferson. We take these matters very seriously, and I'd like to assure you that we'll be conducting sensitivity training for all staff. I've already arranged for an external consultant to come in next week." "That's a good start," Maya replied, leaning forward slightly. "But I'd like to see something more concrete. Sensitivity training can be effective, but only if it's part of a larger culture of respect. I'd like us to implement an ongoing program, not just a one-time training session." Mr. Davis seemed taken aback but nodded. "I see what you mean. I suppose we could arrange for quarterly sessions." "Quarterly sessions are a good idea," Maya agreed, "but we need to go further. I want every new hire to receive training as part of their orientation. And we should conduct regular evaluations to ensure these standards are being met consistently. Perhaps even a review system where guests can provide feedback specifically about their experience with the staff." Mr. Davis scribbled notes, his expression shifting from one of tension to understanding. "That sounds reasonable, and I think the review system is a good idea. It could help us identify any issues early on." Maya felt a surge of satisfaction. "I also want to talk about consequences," she continued. "Last night, the hostess and waiter displayed blatant disregard for my grandfather, and it's not enough to simply reprimand them. There needs to be accountability. Staff should know that discrimination or disrespect will result in tangible consequences." Mr. Davis shifted uncomfortably but nodded again. "Understood. I'll draft a policy to address disciplinary actions for incidents like these, and I'll personally see to it that last night's staff receive a formal warning." "Thank you," Maya replied, her tone softening slightly. She could see that Mr. Davis was genuinely taking her concerns to heart. "I believe that with the right systems in place, we can make this restaurant a truly welcoming place for everyone." They spent the next hour discussing the specifics of the new policies, with Mr. Davis noting every detail of Maya's suggestions. By the end of the meeting, they had a comprehensive plan in place, one that would reshape the way the restaurant operated, from hiring practices to guest interactions. As they shook hands, Mr. Davis looked visibly relieved, a weight seemingly lifted from his shoulders. Thank you, Ms. Jefferson. I think this will make a real difference. That's the goal, Maya replied, smiling. Thank you for being open to these changes. She left the restaurant feeling a sense of accomplishment, knowing she had laid the groundwork for a better experience not just for her grandfather, but for every guest who walked through those doors. She couldn't wait to tell him about it. Later that evening, Maya visited her grandfather at his home. Marvin was relaxing in his favorite armchair, a cup of tea resting on the side table. When she entered, he looked up, his eyes lighting up with warmth. Maya, to what do I owe the pleasure? He asked, a playful grin spreading across his face. She walked over and gave him a hug before sitting down across from him. I wanted to tell you about my meeting with the restaurant manager today. We had a very productive conversation. Marvin raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, you really went and did something about it, didn't you? Maya laughed. You know I couldn't let it slide. We agreed on a plan to implement sensitivity training mandatory for all staff, along with a feedback system for guests to report any disrespectful behavior. Marvin's face softened with pride. You know, when I raised you, I hoped you'd grow up to be strong, to stand up for what's right. Seeing you take this on means more to me than I can say. She reached out, taking his hand. Grandpa, you've always been my role model. Watching you handle things with grace and dignity taught me everything I know. This was the least I could do. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on how far they'd come. For Maya, it was a reminder of her roots, of the family values that had shaped her. For Marvin, it was a reassurance that his legacy of resilience would carry on through her. After a while, Marvin spoke up again, his tone thoughtful. You know, Maya, this is a good start. But there's a whole world out there that still needs changing. I've seen it all my life. It's people like you with the courage to make waves who make a difference. Maya nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I'll keep pushing, Grandpa. Wherever I have a say, I'll make sure people are treated with the respect they deserve. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories from Marvin's past and laughing over memories. It was a quiet, peaceful night, one that left Maya feeling grounded and determined to keep fighting for the values her grandfather had instilled in her. As she drove home later that night, she couldn't help but think about the future. The restaurant was just one place, one small change. But there was so much more work to be done, so many more places where people like her grandfather deserved to feel welcome. The thought filled her with both resolve and hope. Tomorrow she would check in on the restaurant, making sure that her plans were being implemented properly. And she would continue to look for ways to expand this kind of change, one step at a time. The following week, Maya returned to the restaurant unannounced to observe how things were progressing. She wanted to see if her conversation with Mr. Davis had truly made an impact, or if her concerns had been brushed aside now that the immediate issue had passed. As she entered, she felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. This visit would reveal whether her plans were being followed through or if further action would be needed. She moved quietly, choosing a seat near the back where she could observe the staff without drawing too much attention. Almost immediately, she noticed a difference. The atmosphere was more attentive, more welcoming. Guests were greeted with warm smiles, and she could see the wait staff moving with a sense of purpose, checking in on tables regularly, making sure everyone felt comfortable. It was subtle, but Maya knew it was the beginning of a cultural shift. After a few minutes, Mr. Davis spotted her from across the room. He approached her table, a look of surprise mixed with genuine respect on his face. Miss Jefferson, he said, greeting her with a nod. It's good to see you here. I didn't realize you were coming in today. Maya smiled, gesturing for him to take a seat. I wanted to see how things were going, she replied. You know, make sure our plans are being followed through. Mr. Davis nodded, visibly pleased. I think you'll be happy with the progress. We've started the first round of sensitivity training sessions, and I've received positive feedback from the staff who attended. It's early, but I believe the change is already making an impact. Maya leaned forward, listening intently. That's good to hear. I can already feel a shift in the atmosphere, she said, glancing around the room. But I'm also interested in hearing what the staff think about the changes. Are they on board? Mr. Davis paused, considering her question. To be honest, there was some initial resistance, he admitted. A few of them didn't understand why the training was necessary, especially the more experienced staff who felt they already knew how to handle guests. But after the first session, I think most of them began to see the value. Maya nodded thoughtfully. She understood that resistance was natural, especially in industries with established routines and hierarchies. It's important that they not only see the value but feel invested in it. I'd like us to conduct follow-up sessions where staff can voice their thoughts and concerns openly. Sometimes, when people are given a chance to share, they're more likely to embrace change. Mr. Davis looked thoughtful. I think that's a great idea. We could set up monthly meetings where they can discuss any issues or suggestions for improvement. That way, we're not just enforcing policies from above but creating a space for real dialogue. Maya smiled, pleased with his response. Exactly. The goal isn't just to change behavior for the sake of it, but to build a culture where respect is part of everyone's mindset, from the moment they walk in to the moment they leave. They discussed a few more details, and as they spoke, Maya's conviction only grew. It was one thing to set up policies, but ensuring that they were deeply integrated into the restaurant's culture required sustained effort and attention. She could tell that Mr. Davis was genuinely committed, and that reassured her. She would stay involved, of course, but it was good to know she wasn't alone in this mission. Just as their conversation was wrapping up, Maya spotted the same hostess from the previous week moving through the dining area. The young woman's demeanor seemed different, less hurried, more attentive to the guests around her. Maya observed as she greeted a group of older patrons, her smile warm and genuine, guiding them to a comfortable table by the windows. When the hostess glanced in her direction and noticed her, she hesitated, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. She approached Maya's table with a tentative smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Jefferson," she said politely. "It's nice to see you again." Maya offered a smile in return. "Good afternoon. It seems like things are going well today." The hostess nodded, visibly relieved by Maya's friendly tone. "Yes, they are. I just wanted to thank you for the changes you suggested. I didn't understand them at first, but I think they're making a difference. It's made me see things a little differently." Maya's smile deepened. "I'm glad to hear that. Respect is something that should come naturally, but sometimes it takes a little encouragement to see things from another perspective." The hostess nodded, looking down slightly, as if reflecting on her previous behavior. "I appreciate the chance to learn from it," she said softly. "Thank you for giving us the opportunity to grow." After the hostess left, Maya turned back to Mr. Davis. "It seems the message is starting to sink in," she said, feeling a sense of satisfaction. "But we need to keep this momentum going. Real change takes time and dedication." Mr. Davis agreed, and they continued their discussion, finalizing a few more details for the follow-up sessions. When they finished, Maya felt confident that the foundation for lasting change had been set. She thanked Mr. Davis and left the restaurant, a sense of accomplishment filling her as she walked out into the afternoon sun. Over the next few weeks, Maya kept close tabs on the restaurant, checking in periodically and following up with Mr. Davis. Each time she visited, she noticed more signs of positive change. The staff seemed more attentive, and the guests appeared genuinely at ease. Word had even spread among the patrons that the restaurant was embracing a new, more inclusive approach to service. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and Maya was proud to see her vision becoming a reality. One day, Marvin joined her for lunch at the restaurant, eager to see the changes for himself. They were seated at a prime table by the windows, with a beautiful view of the city. Marvin looked around, observing the staff as they moved gracefully through the dining area, serving guests with genuine warmth and care. "You know, Maya," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride, "I can feel the difference. It's like the whole place has a new energy." Maya smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. "That's what I wanted, Grandpa. For people to walk in here and feel like they belong, like they're respected. You taught me that everyone deserves that." Marvin squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with emotion. "And you made it happen. I'm so proud of you, Maya." They enjoyed a leisurely lunch together, the staff treating Marvin with the utmost respect and attention. It was a stark contrast to his first experience, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of joy, knowing that this change had come about because of Maya's dedication. She had taken a difficult situation and turned it into an opportunity for growth, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. As they left the restaurant that afternoon, Marvin felt a renewed sense of pride in his granddaughter. She had shown him that change was possible, even in places where it seemed unlikely. And she had reminded him that standing up for one's dignity was always worth it, no matter the challenges. A few months after the initial changes were implemented, the restaurant had fully embraced the new standards of respect and inclusivity that Maya had envisioned. The establishment was thriving, not just in terms of business but also in atmosphere. The shift was palpable, and regular patrons noticed it too. The staff had grown accustomed to the new culture, which now felt as natural as any other aspect of their work. Reviews started pouring in, praising the restaurant's welcoming environment and attentive service, and even the employees seemed happier, more connected to the work they were doing. Marvin often returned to the restaurant, usually accompanied by Maya or other family members, and each time he was greeted with genuine warmth. He was a familiar face now, well known by the staff, who greeted him as one of their own. It was a source of quiet pride for him to see the impact Maya had made, not just for him but for everyone who walked through those doors. One afternoon, Marvin decided to visit the restaurant on his own. He wanted to see if things had truly changed, not just for himself but for any older person who might visit. As he entered, he was greeted by the hostess, a new one he hadn't seen before, who offered him a smile and asked if he'd prefer a seat by the windows. The small act filled him with reassurance that the changes had taken root, even beyond Maya's immediate influence. As he settled into his seat, enjoying the view of the bustling city beyond the glass, a couple at a nearby table caught his attention. They were elderly, perhaps in their late 70s, and were having trouble flagging down a waiter. Marvin observed as a waiter quickly noticed them and approached with a warm smile, taking their order with a respect that was once rare here. Marvin felt a sense of satisfaction, seeing the changes in action. This place was finally becoming the inclusive space Maya had worked so hard to create. Midway through his meal, a man walked into the restaurant, a sharp-dressed, middle-aged man with an air of importance about him. Marvin noticed that the man seemed impatient, glancing around the restaurant with a slight frown. The man caught the attention of the same hostess who had seated Marvin, and his tone was brisk, almost dismissive. "I'd like a table by the window," the man demanded, without so much as a greeting. The hostess maintained her calm demeanor, nodding politely. "Of course, sir. Let me check our available seating." Marvin watched as she glanced around the room, her eyes settling briefly on Marvin's table. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, as though she were considering asking him to move. But after a moment, she looked back at the man and said, "I'm afraid our window seats are currently taken, but I can offer you a table nearby." The man's expression soured, and he cast a dismissive glance in Marvin's direction. "Is there no way to accommodate me? I'd think a restaurant of this caliber could manage a simple seating request." The hostess's expression remained composed as she replied, "I'm sorry, sir, but we treat all our guests with equal consideration. I'll make sure you have a comfortable seat nearby." Marvin felt a swell of pride watching the exchange. The hostess had remained respectful but firm, upholding the new policies Maya had instilled. She hadn't allowed herself to be intimidated by the man's attitude, nor had she compromised the integrity of the restaurant's values. As the man was seated, he glanced at Marvin with a slight sneer, as though questioning why an elderly man like him should hold a prime seat by the windows. Marvin met his gaze with quiet confidence, unbothered by the silent judgment. He had spent a lifetime dealing with dismissive attitudes, and now, thanks to Maya, he didn't have to let them affect him anymore. Just as Marvin finished his meal, Maya entered the restaurant. She had planned to meet him for dessert, wanting to catch up and hear about his experience with the restaurant's changes. She spotted him immediately and made her way over, her face lighting up as she greeted him. "Grandpa," she said, giving him a warm hug. "How was everything? I hope they took good care of you." Marvin chuckled, gesturing to his empty plate. "They did more than take care of me. I think you'd be proud of how the staff handled things today." Maya raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, did something happen?" Marvin leaned back, recounting the incident with the impatient man and the hostess's calm yet firm response. Maya listened intently, a smile spreading across her face as she absorbed every detail. "That's wonderful to hear," she said when he finished. "It sounds like the culture we're trying to build here is finally taking root." Marvin nodded, his eyes full of pride. "You've done good work, Maya. People feel valued here now, and that's no small accomplishment." They ordered a dessert to share, savoring the sweet, rich flavors as they talked. Maya was genuinely curious to know if there were any other ways they could improve the guest experience. She knew her grandfather's insight was invaluable, and she didn't want to miss any opportunity to make the restaurant even better. As they chatted, Mr. Davis approached their table, his expression respectful and warm. He greeted Marvin with a nod before turning to Maya. "Ms. Jefferson, I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done for this place. I don't think I realized how much of a difference these changes would make until I saw it with my own eyes." Maya smiled, gesturing for him to join them. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. But it wasn't just me. You've done an incredible job leading the team and making sure the new standards are upheld." Mr. Davis looked humbled. "I appreciate that. I have to admit, when you first proposed these changes, I was worried there might be pushback from both the staff and our regular patrons. But the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. People are noticing the difference, and it's reflected in everything we do now." Marvin listened quietly, a content smile on his face. It was deeply fulfilling to see how far things had come. The restaurant was thriving not just as a business but as a place where people could feel respected and appreciated. After Mr. Davis excused himself to attend to other guests, Maya turned to her grandfather, her eyes shining. "You know, Grandpa, you were the inspiration behind all of this. I never would have thought to make these changes if it weren't for what happened that night." Marvin's face softened with emotion, his gaze full of pride and gratitude. "Sometimes it takes a little push to make things right," he replied gently. "But you did more than just make a change, you created a legacy of respect. That's something not many people can say." Maya squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his words settle in her heart. It was true. The impact of her actions would extend beyond her own life, influencing everyone who worked or dined in this restaurant for years to come. As they prepared to leave, Marvin glanced around the restaurant one last time. The atmosphere was warm, lively, filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. He could feel the spirit of inclusivity and respect radiating through the space, a tangible testament to Maya's dedication and values. They walked to the exit together, side by side, with Maya holding her grandfather's arm. As they passed by the tables, a few of the staff members and even some guests gave Marvin friendly nods and smiles, recognizing him as a valued patron. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to him. This was no longer just a restaurant, it was a place where he felt seen, appreciated, and at home. Stepping out into the cool evening air, Maya took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. She had done what she set out to do, transforming the restaurant into a space where people like her grandfather and everyone else could feel truly valued. "Thank you, Maya," Marvin said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." She looked at him, her own eyes misty with gratitude. "No, Grandpa. Thank you. For showing me what it means to stand up for what's right." They walked together down the city street, their hearts full, knowing that they had left an indelible mark, not just on the restaurant, but on each other's lives. Months passed and Maya's changes at the restaurant had become second nature. The staff no longer needed reminders or extra training sessions to embrace the culture of respect she'd introduced. They lived it every day. Patrons had begun to take note, leaving reviews that praised not just the food but the exceptional treatment they received. It had even garnered a reputation in the local press as one of the most welcoming and inclusive spots in the city, a designation Maya hadn't anticipated but deeply appreciated. One evening, the restaurant prepared for a particularly busy night. The city's mayor had booked a table to celebrate a community event, and several prominent locals would be attending. The atmosphere was charged with excitement as the staff polished tables, adjusted place settings, and ensured every detail was perfect. Maya was in the restaurant office going over paperwork, checking the evening's reservations to ensure the night would go smoothly. She wanted everything to be perfect for the high-profile guests, but she also knew it was a chance for the restaurant to demonstrate its commitment to welcoming everyone. As she reviewed the evening's schedule, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Marvin, who had recently begun visiting the restaurant on his own every few weeks, quietly observing the changes as they continued to settle into place. She opened the message, a smile spreading across her face as she read it. "Stopping by the restaurant for dinner tonight. Looking forward to seeing everyone." Maya chuckled, amused by her grandfather's subtle way of saying he was coming to check up on things. She replied, telling him to enjoy his meal and promising to say hello if he was still there by the time she finished her work. An hour later, as the restaurant began to fill with guests, Marvin arrived. The hostess recognized him immediately, greeting him with a warm smile as she guided him to his favorite table by the window. Marvin settled in, feeling a familiar sense of contentment as he watched the restaurant staff move with ease and purpose around the room. He felt proud not just of Maya but of everyone who had embraced this change. It was something he'd never expected to see, yet here it was. Not long after he'd ordered, a couple entered the restaurant, pausing at the hostess stand with a look of uncertainty. They were elderly, dressed in modest clothes, and seemed somewhat out of place amid the elegant decor and polished clientele. The hostess greeted them warmly, just as she had Marvin, and asked if they had a reservation. The man hesitated, glancing at his wife before answering, "No, we don't. We heard about this place, and we thought we'd try it out. We weren't sure if we'd need one." The hostess nodded, her smile never faltering. "That's perfectly fine, sir. Let me see if we can accommodate you." She glanced around the room, spotting a small table near the center of the dining area. She led them over, her manner friendly and reassuring, making sure they were comfortable before handing them menus. Marvin observed this exchange with quiet satisfaction. The couple's uncertainty reminded him of his first experience here, and he felt a sense of vindication knowing that now, they wouldn't have to feel the same alienation he once had. As he continued his meal, he noticed the mayor and her entourage enter the restaurant, greeted by the manager and escorted to a table near the back where they could enjoy some privacy. The presence of the prominent guests didn't affect the staff's attentiveness. They continued to treat every guest with the same care, ensuring that everyone from high-profile attendees to everyday patrons received equal respect. Midway through the evening, Maya emerged from the back, her expression calm yet alert as she checked in on the dining area. Her eyes lit up as she spotted her grandfather, and she made her way over, pausing to greet a few familiar faces along the way. "Grandpa," she greeted him warmly, bending down to give him a hug. "Enjoying yourself?" Marvin grinned, gesturing to his plate. "The food's wonderful, as always. But I have to say, I'm more impressed by the people. They've come a long way, Maya." She smiled, her eyes reflecting both pride and relief. They really have. It's become second nature to them now. They don't even have to think about it, it's just part of who they are here. They shared a quiet moment, watching as the restaurant buzzed with life. Maya felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment, knowing that her grandfather had witnessed the transformation from beginning to end. Just then, Marvin noticed the couple who had entered earlier. They were seated at a table nearby, laughing and talking softly as they shared a meal. Their initial hesitation had vanished, replaced by a look of contentment as they enjoyed the evening, no longer self-conscious about being in a space that might once have felt out of reach. Marvin leaned toward Maya, nodding subtly in the couple's direction. "Look at them," he said quietly. "They look like they belong here, don't they?" Maya followed his gaze, her expression softening as she took in the scene. "They do," she replied, her voice filled with satisfaction. "And they do belong. That's what this place is meant for now for everyone." As the evening wore on, the restaurant continued to bustle with energy. The mayor's group enjoyed their evening undisturbed, while patrons of all backgrounds, ages, and walks of life dined alongside one another, creating a tapestry of humanity that filled the space with warmth and inclusivity. Eventually, Marvin finished his meal, and Maya walked him to the door. They paused just outside, the cool night air wrapping around them as they looked back at the bustling restaurant, illuminated by the soft glow of its lights. "You know, Maya," Marvin said, his tone thoughtful, "when I first walked into this place, I thought it was too good for someone like me. I never expected to feel at home here." Maya looked at him, her eyes bright with affection. "You've always deserved to feel at home, Grandpa, here and anywhere else." He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've created something special, something that goes beyond just this place. You've shown people how powerful respect can be. I don't think I could be prouder of you." She smiled, feeling her heart swell with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandpa. None of this would have happened without you. You showed me what real dignity looks like." They stood together for a few moments longer, taking in the sight of the restaurant as it continued to thrive. People came and went, laughter and conversation spilling into the night, a testament to the community they had built within those walls. As they parted ways, Maya walked back into the restaurant, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. There were still many places beyond these walls that needed change, still many people who deserved to feel respected and valued. But for tonight, she was content knowing that here, at least, her work had made a lasting difference. And as Marvin walked away into the night, he carried with him the quiet pride of knowing that his granddaughter had built a legacy that would endure long after them, a place where respect and dignity weren't just ideals but realities, lived out every day.